Have you ever played Watch Dogs, Assassin's Creed, Minecraft, League of Legends? Have you heard of XSI, Maya, 3D Max, Motion Builder? Then you know what this episode is about. Lars Bonde started in 3D animation and cinematics and is now a video game producer at a startup company from California. He worked for many years at Ubisoft in Montreal and he has extensive experience in this industry. I'm very happy, Lars, because, I know what you do, but I really don't know exactly what you do. So I would love you to tell me, what is your job?
Well, currently, it's changed a lot over the last years, but currently I'm a producer at a new startup company in California for video games. That entitles, in essence, I'm building a team, taking care of the budgets, of course, and all the planning around making a game. So that would be responsible for making the game design document together with the creative director and the game designers, presenting to our partner, making sure that the budgets are being held. But it's a big change from what I used to do. I'm originally an animator and a cinematographer by trade. That's what I started in. So I did some advertisement work a long time ago and then went into 3D animation. And that's kind of how I got into games.
So animator, what is that?
Yeah, well, an animator, typically what people would know is they watch a Pixar movie or watch the cartoons on TV, and that would be people that sit on a computer or sit on and draw animation and make characters come to life. But in computer games, it's really all based on 3D. So it's making characters in computer games come to life. It can be anything from how they walk around in the game to cinematics, we call it, which are more the story moments of games. So in the last few years, I focused more on the story elements of it. So it's more on the cinematic side, which is, more high render, high quality characters and scenes. So I work with actors and do motion capture and all this other stuff. But before, it was more what we call gameplay animation. So that means that you have this character that's made in 3D, and we put this very simplified skeleton inside the character that I then move around to make the characters come alive. Just like you would see, traditional animator would paint or draw on paper and would make the characters come alive. We just do it on the computer.
You finished high school and then you went to university.
Yes.
Is that right? Okay. What was the major?
Well, I started out in business and finance, actually.
Oh.
Yeah. And I was in Denmark originally, and then I went to University of Oregon to continue my studies, which was a lot of fun. But when I came back home, I kind of knew that business and finance wasn't really the thing I wanted to do. And it was an idea to work with my family. They had a family-run company that I was maybe going to get involved in, but my parents wanted to retire early. So I was like, you know what? I'm going to try and figure something out that I really want to do. And at the time, I was really interested in 3D and visual effects. But this is, in the 90s where there's not, some school that are teaching you these things, because it was really the early days of 3D. So I just kind of started learning by myself, and I found this kind of school that was a new project where they started trying to teach 3D, but through cinematography. So we learned about TV and film, I would say more aimed at advertisements. And that's what I ended up working with to start with at a TV station. But after that, it was really just playing around with 3D for myself. So I never originally studied 3D or visual effects.
Mm-hmm.
So I started a small company with a friend of mine, and we got into 3D more and more and just had some fun with it. And it was not until early 2000 that I went to Vancouver Film School and studied animation and 3D specifically.
Mm. So in the beginning, did you just learn by doing?
Yes. It's the cliche for a lot of people working in games that's my age. I'm, mid-40s at this point. So I hate to admit that, but that's the truth.
But it's a great age.
Yeah, no, for sure. But, in games, you start feeling a little old when you're 45. But most of us, I would say, in games that are around my age are, they're self-taught to some extent. And it's that cliche of, did you just sit at home in the basement on the computer all the time? To some extent, yes, I was a lot on the computer, partially because I'm not a great artist in the way of drawing. My drawing capabilities are quite limited. So I used the computer to express my art, if you will. And that's how I fell into animation originally.
And so you were playing video games and then you were creating 3D animations.
Yes, that's, I remember like, some of the first movies that really, the first movie that was trying to be a big Hollywood 3D movie was a movie called Final Fantasy back in the day. And, I got really inspired by that. And with a friend of mine, Karsten, we just, instead of playing computer games, we started switching over to just what is this 3D? How do we get better at it? How do we learn about it? And then The Matrix came out in, what was that, 96 or 99 or something like that? Yeah. And that was kind of like, okay, this is what I want to do for life. So that kind of led me along that way. And there was no schools in Denmark at the time to do that. You just sit and practice by yourself.
Right. And what software were you using back then?
Back then, it was called Softimage originally. And then that transitioned into a program called XSI. Those were like my first entries into 3D. But for sure, the key program that is really still around today is Maya and also 3D Max to some extent. But Maya was really like the dominating software. And I started modeling in Maya when it was not even a full release yet. It was like version 0.8b or something. And there were, so back then it was easy to get access on that for the internet. It was easy to get access to the programs because they were just learning and growing, so it was fun to start and see the development. But today, a lot of it is done still in Maya. I've used a program called Motion Builder as well. Motion Builder is specific for motion capture, but it's also quite easy to do what we call keyframe animation on the computer. I like it a lot. It's very fast.
Okay. What's keyframe animation?
Yeah, so keyframe animation is pretty much the general term for doing animation in a way, but there's two different principles to it. There's kind of like animating straight ahead, and then there's keyframe animation. If you do keyframe animation, typically it's, if you think of an artist, if you look at Disney, when they draw Mickey Mouse or something like that, that means that there's 24 frames per second, typically. So maybe out of those 24 frames, there's maybe one that's like the key pose. And then there's maybe 3 other poses that are also kind of key poses. So you have like a certain amount of keyframes, and then that's the master frames out of the 24. And in between, it's literally called in betweens. So you make like, let's say if you have an animation that's 3 seconds or something like that, you might have 10 keyframes and the rest is in betweens. And you kind of set the keys when you move the character into the position you want. You set one key, then you move like maybe half a second forward. You then pose the character the way you want, then set another keyframe, and then you continue like that. And the computer will translate the movement in between the keyframes. It's not always correct, so you go in and fix the in-betweens. But for straight ahead, which is what I kind of did because I had an ability to kind of see time more, so I didn't worry about keyframes. I just started animating straight ahead. That means like I just go from key 1 to key 2 to key 3, and I kept just kind of going through it that way. I didn't plan my animation necessarily. I already had it in my head. So instead of these key poses, you just kind of draw from frame 1 and continue on.
What are the main roles when you produce a video game?
Well, I can start addressing how it's changed. I think when I got my first job, my first job was actually in Stockholm in Sweden. But the perception was, when you make a game that it's like, 5 guys that are sitting in a garage or something like that, making a game, which is not the case at the time. Even then, it was typically like maybe 50, 60 people on a game. There were smaller games that are done by just a handful of people. But today, on an average big game like you see on a PlayStation 5, there's anywhere from, maybe 60 people, but all the way up to like 500, 600, 700 people working on a game, depending on the size of the game. Yeah.
It's like a proper production, like a film production.
Yes. So in terms of the roles, back in the day, it used to be that there was many more generalists that did a lot of everything. So you might have a producer, still like a creative director of some sort, and then maybe 5 programmers that do, make the engine work, which is the backbone of any kind of game. And then you might have animators and modelers. Modelers are the ones that make the 3D characters typically. And you have an audio engineer maybe and an audio designer. All that kind of comes together. But today it's like, on a big, let's say, Assassin's Creed game at Ubisoft, where there's maybe 3, 4, 500 people working, you might have 30 animators and you might have 50 programmers and 20 engineers. You might have an executive producer with one senior producer, and then maybe 5 associate producers, and then maybe another 10 production managers for all the different aspects of the game. You have scripting, you have modelers that are character modelers or environment modeling, props modeling, like if anybody needs glass or something like that, that's props. And then you have an audio department, and the audio department might be still 5 people on the team as well. So it's huge. When I was on my last project at Ubisoft, for example, and I sent my goodbye email, this was on Watch Dogs 2, I think my email went out to like 500 and some people. Yeah.
Oh, wow.
So there's many different roles. I mean, it takes a lot of people to put a game together today. But at the same time, there's also what we call indie games, which are smaller scoped games. And they could be done, I had a friend who just did an app, for example, like a small game, and he was the only one doing it. But the scope is, of course, also accordingly. But you also have all the small garage type setups where it's like maybe 6 guys or 10 guys. Not that they're all men, but unfortunately, it is a pretty male-dominated world. But like maybe 6, 10 people. But on an average size company that make bigger games, you're at least somewhere around 60 to maybe 300 people on a production.
Mm-hmm. What are the main companies out there? You were mentioning Ubisoft, where you yourself worked.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's Ubisoft for sure. Electronic Arts, that people might know, that do FIFA and all these other sports games, plus, Battlefield. Mm-hmm. And they have a lot of collaboration now on the Star Wars games as well. There's Activision that merged with Blizzard. So there's Activision Blizzard. God, I mean, those are some of the big players, but there's a lot of other players on the market.
What are the countries that you would say are the main countries for video game production?
It's shifted a little bit. If you look at the UK, for example, there used to be a big dominance of studios in the UK, but that's gone down a lot over the years. There's still some really good studios in the UK. And then there's, of course, in the US, I'd say primarily around the Seattle area or San Francisco and Los Angeles, in that area in California. And there's a little bit in New York as well. And then also in Austin, Texas. It's really one of the new hubs. But where I'm at now is in Montreal, Canada. And it's, I'd say probably, with the amount of people, it's probably the biggest game hub in the world right now. There's a lot of reasons for that, but almost every major game studio is represented in Montreal in some way or another, because Quebec and even the Canadian government do tax credits for several multimedia/game developments. So, for example, if you make the game in Quebec and you make it in French, there can be tax credits of each employee of 37.5%. So that's, very attractive for the gaming industry, for all the companies. Then there's also, if you do research and development on the engineering side, the Canadian government subsidizes, I think, up to about 20% tax credit on that too. So it creates a little bit of an unfair balance, but it really has centralized a lot of the development here in Montreal. And over the last, I'd say, 5-10 years, a lot of the big visual effects studios have come to Montreal as well. So you have NBC, Frame Store, I think they're probably also their biggest studios is here. So it's games and visual effects is really dominant in Montreal. But you still have hubs like Stockholm and Sweden. They've been really progressive on game development. They have EA is there, but that's originally was DICE that now became EA. There's Paradox, Starbreeze, Avalanche, a bunch of other studios in Stockholm. You have Guerrilla Games in Amsterdam. It's fantastic. And when you have a major game company like that as well, a lot of smaller companies typically tend to spring up from that. When people have worked a long time at one company, they might try their own business. And so you have a lot of smaller studios around as well. And that's happening here in Montreal as well. And then there's, of course, in Singapore as well, there's some, and in China as well, there's really like a big in Shanghai as well, and Chengdu as well. There's some bigger studios there now too. Korea as well has some studios, but primarily I'd say it's still North America. That's the key driver, and then some European countries.
What is a product that people may know that you have worked on?
It's a good
Oh,
question.
many.
I'm thinking. Well, I moved to Montreal originally to work on a reboot of Prince of Persia, but it never ended up materializing. So I spent 2 years working on that before it got dropped, and then I went on Watch Dogs. People might have heard on Watch Dogs. I never worked on Assassin's Creed, even though it's the biggest franchise, I would say, probably at Ubisoft.
Mm.
Of more old school gamers, depending on how old people are listening in, I worked on the remake of Bionic Commando, which is an old Capcom classic. I really enjoyed that. I worked on Ghost Recon as well. But more recently, I worked on Fortnite, which is probably what most people would have heard of. And I apologize to all the parents out there.
So now you're a producer, right? So do you still do some 3D animations, or you're really more like I would think a film producer would be like?
It's similar to a film producer, but yeah, no, animation. I haven't, well, it's not fully true. At my last job, I worked for Starbreeze in Sweden. I did actually step in and help a little bit on animation as well and shooting mocap. I was, in that sense, kind of helping leading up the animation team. But no, I'd say over the last 5-6 years, it's very limited what I've been doing animation wise. I'm very interested in it and I still follow it, but it's not that I'm hands on animating anymore. And as a producer, you just don't have time. There's just too many aspects that you're, involved in. Everything from trying to find new talent, hiring, even some HR stuff, taking care of budgets, making sure you have all the right meetings, even finding money, as is the case now too, as well, or, presenting to your partners, making sure that everybody's happy on the team. And yeah, you participate maybe in the design process a little bit. But in terms of animation itself, no, I haven't touched that for quite some years.
Mm-hmm. And when you have a production, let's say, a video game to produce, where does it start? Does it start from an idea? Does it start from funding? When do you come in the process?
Well, it really depends. Let's say I mentioned Starbreeze that I worked on. They were working on The Walking Dead. Obviously, that was a game inspired off the TV series and on the comic books. So that was where the idea started. They wanted to try and make a bigger scale Walking Dead game than the game Telltale had done. If it's at Ubisoft, yeah, it typically starts with an idea. Watch Dogs was an idea that was in development for a couple of years before we really started development on that. And it took about 5 years to make that game. So it can really start just with this idea of like, hey, okay, we want to make a game based on a hacker because there's all this like talk about social media, Facebook, and cybersecurity, that we're all being reduced to data. So that was kind of the idea that started from that, kind of like the TV show Mr. Robot, if people know about that.
Mm-hmm.
And that could be that idea that kind of sparks off something. Presently, the game that I'm working on that I can't mention, but it's an idea based on some old literature, which is really interesting as well. So it depends. It could be an IP that's existing, just like The Walking Dead is an intellectual property that exists, and you develop a game based on that. Or it can be like often what happens at Ubisoft. They have an idea and they try something out and they focus group test it. And if it responds really well, then they set the game into full production.
Okay. So if someone wants to break into the industry, then Montreal is the place to be, more or less, I would guess.
Yeah, it's definitely one of the hubs. Toronto is also kind of starting to be one of the places. Vancouver used to be a bigger hub. It's not as big anymore, but that would be some of the places. Depends on where you're from. I also find if you find a good school, that can help a lot as well, because today there are so many different schools out there that now teach 3D, whether it's visual effects or character modeling or animation or game design, audio design for games. Yeah, even if you go to a university today, you're becoming a programmer of some sort. There's probably courses at most of those universities that are big today that actually say like, okay, you can be a programmer towards the game industry or towards some other industry. So
right. Of all the profiles that you have mentioned, what are the most sought after roles? Let's say maybe some that are not so easy to find in the market.
People that are always in demand are engineers and programmers. That's one part of it, just because that's one of the fields where gaming is competing against a lot of other industries. The programmers could work at Facebook or Google instead. So obviously it's attractive to work on some of them social media companies or working on different apps or whatever. So the gaming industry is also trying to be competitive on that area to make sure they can attract the programmers or the engineers. On the other side of it, I'd say today, one of the things, it's more niche, but it's called technical artists or technical directors. So it's people that are good at understanding the technicalities of a program to maybe create, the rig, like I mentioned, that skeleton that you put inside a character, for example, or how how to make effects in the software within the gaming environment. So technical artists, programmers, engineers are probably the most sought after.
Okay, when you say engineers, who do you refer to particularly?
Oh, I mean, an engineer in a way, I guess, is also really like a programmer, but it's more like focused on like engine development or deep calculations on lighting systems, on how lights are supposed to work in the game. So they really optimize code to run efficiently in runtime environments. So that's the engineering side of it. They could make tools, they could make audio engines, or like one of the big engines that's out there is called Unreal. It's Unreal 4. Unreal 5 is the new engine that's about to release here in this year, I hope. And they would probably have, like, I don't know, 100, maybe 150 engineers working on an engine, because there's all kinds of calculations that needs to be done, a system that needs to be created. There's a lot of thinking that goes into that. Where a programmer, as a generalist, often is more maybe a gameplay programmer. So that means if you imagine that you have your joypad that plugs into your PlayStation, what happens when I move the stick forward? What happens when I press A? Like, that's a gameplay programmer that kind of sets all those things together. The other big part of it, where engineers and programmers are both very interesting right now, is of course artificial intelligence, machine learning. Those are some of them, especially machine learning is some of the newer fields that games are really trying to tap into, because it's always extremely hard to create artificial intelligence in the game. If we want to recreate a living world and you're running around in it, you don't want to see everybody else in the world run around like as if they're stupid, running into like a building or being run over by a car. So creating complex, sophisticated AI is definitely in high demand.
That's very interesting. For actors, what kind of actors do you search? Because I can imagine there is some acting involved, of course, but there must be some other aspects in the acting that you are looking for that is not necessarily traditional actor.
Well, it depends what game you're on and what budgets we're talking about. But I've been fortunate enough at Ubisoft to work on some big productions that had big budgets in terms of acting. What people would, I guess, most often think about is that, we create the animation on the character and there's some actor that just goes in a sound studio and records a voice. That used to be true maybe 10, 15 years ago. It's not true anymore. The way I ran the last two big games that I worked on at Ubisoft, where I was responsible for the cinematics, like I mentioned earlier, which is the story elements of the game typically, you could easily produce a full feature-length film with the cinematics. I think Watch Dogs 1, I think we had maybe 2.5 hours of cinematic in there. Watch Dogs 2 is maybe 3 hours of cinematic. So the way I did it is we go into this motion capture studio. Ubisoft has their own motion capture studio that's quite big here in Montreal. And motion captures, if people haven't seen it, it's where you kind of have this tight Lycra suit on with a bunch of dots on it and a bunch of cameras that are mounted on the walls all around. That's infrared. And they pick up on where all the dots on you are at any given time. And it's become so complex that today we can put, I'd say, somewhere between 6 to 12 actors at the same time in a big volume. So I would recreate a scene just like you would on a TV set or a film set. We would, granted, the set doesn't look the same because we want to make sure the cameras can see through everything. So if you have a table, for example, it's often made out of a grid so the cameras can see through, or plexiglass or something like that. But I would have camera guys on set. So last time I shot with typically 3 camera guys on set that film everything at the same time. I would have 2 boom operators that hold the microphones to make sure all the actors, when they speak, are recorded, because we record live on set, just like they would on film. Sometimes we can replace some of the voices afterwards, but it's rare. Then we have a bunch of engineers as well, that runs the shoot. And I stand on the side after I've given direction. They run a scene, and I, just like, I say cut, or, action, and you give them direction, and you just do as many takes as you need, just like film and TV. And what I look for in those actors, I mean, I would do casting for Watch Dogs. I would fly to Los Angeles, I would fly to New York, Vancouver, Toronto, and just do casting for actors just like you would for film. What I do look for in actors like that is typically people that don't over exaggerate, because people have a tendency to think, oh, it's a computer game. And it's also weird when you have the suit on, they try to exaggerate all the movements. So it's kind of like they think they're on a theater stage where the audience is sitting far away. So they're like projecting their voice, or they're making really big gestures. They're pointing in a way that doesn't look natural. So that's why I thought that it helped to put the camera guys in there, because it makes the actors feel more like they're on TV or on film. So I really look for actors that are very true to the character and perform well and are charismatic, because we look for the same qualities as you would if you made a cool TV show for HBO or a big film.
Yeah, for sure. And I'm sure that also these productions are very expensive. So I don't know if
Yeah.
if the information is out there, if it's public. Like, for instance, we know that some film productions are, 100 million. They cost 100 million. I don't know if you have.
Yeah, I won't mention what games necessarily, but I've worked on games that would cost in production somewhere between probably 75 to 100 million dollars.
Right.
And then the marketing budget is maybe 50 to 75 million dollars on top of that. So yeah, it wouldn't be unusual for a big game today to cost somewhere between 100 to 200 million dollars to make.
And how much then would a product like this make over time?
Yeah, that really depends on what kind of product you are. It used to be that, it's a shelf product. So it's a disc, you put it on the shelf and you sell it and people play it. And it has a shelf life typically of somewhere between 6 to 12 months where people are still interested in it. And then they move on to the next game. Those types of games, let's say for an Assassin's Creed, if it maybe cost $100 million to make, this is just numbers I'm making up.
Yeah.
They might make $500 million or maybe $1 billion on that. So it's still a good investment, but there are games out there that are now focused more on live service, we call it. So that means that they're multiplayer. People can get new updates all the time and continue to play and develop their characters or get better at the game and unlock new things. And there's new things that gets released. That's where some games are created that's called free to play. Like Fortnite is free to play, but when you play a game like that, it might have cost $20 million to make the game, but they might make, 200 million in a month. And they might, if they can continue to live over 10 years, you can figure out how much money that would be.
Oh, so incredible. Yeah.
Games long time ago. I can't say exactly when that happened, but it's definitely quite a few years ago that games overtook Hollywood to be a much bigger moneymaker than the music and film industry as a whole.
What will be the future of video gaming?
A lot of people are looking for that right now. It's one of the things that I'm actually myself gotten a little tired of in some ways. Is this like always making longer and longer games, so it's like 100-hour game or 150 hours that you play the same game. I miss sometimes these, smaller games that it took me 10 hours to finish and I had a really, really good time and then I move on. But it's there to stay because people get used to it, like Fortnite or There's another shooting game, for example, that's called Player Unknown, or you have Destiny as well, for example. That is like this, like persistent online game where you always continue playing more and more. And I think that is where games are going. It's going to be that the games are online all the time, and it's games as a service, not as a single standing product. So you buy into a game, and they will continue servicing that game for many years. I think that's going to continue, and that's for sure the big industry right now is that, like, speaking of Fortnite, for example. But you can also see that there has been a big increase in indie games, smaller games that are developed. That's not necessarily, online all the time or whatever, but there are smaller games. Like you can have a game that's called Limbo that was made by a Danish company called Play Dead. Journey is another great example. There's a lot of these really small, really cute, like really nice games that you spend maybe 10, 20 hours on or something like that, and that's it. So there's going to be two branches. I think there's going to be the ones that really focus on big online experiences where investments are just going to continue increasing because players are expecting more and more. So it's going to be bigger and bigger budget productions. And then there's going to be the other side of it, the smaller, more easy to manage games, but that are also less costly to make.
I want to start working in the video gaming industry. Do I knock at doors? Do I have to know people, like it often is the case in the film industry? Do I need to build up my CV, or should I maybe study first? What would you suggest would be one path or two paths that you would recommend?
So it's a great question. I get asked that a lot. People hit me up on LinkedIn or something like that I don't know, and they're like, how do I get into video games? I mean, CV definitely matters, but if you're not in the industry, it's really hard to build up your CV, and it doesn't matter what you really did outside, typically, if it was not related to games. So study is definitely, like, I'd say probably the most direct way. I study a field that's, related to games. It could be animation, it could be, audio engineering, it could be programming. It depends what you're interested in. And I would say that's the most direct way, because if you are at a good school, a lot of the big studios are already looking at, when the students graduate, they look at who is graduating and giving offers if there's somebody interesting there. But it can also be that you know somebody who's working in it, and you start, for example, play testing. So a lot of the bigger companies, that have testers that come in, and maybe they're hired even full time, and you sit and you test the games for bugs, like all small things that needs to be fixed. That's one way to get into it, where you can then eventually become a game designer or a level designer or something like that. But I'd say that the easiest is to go get some education. I wish that I could have done more of that originally, because it would have driven me more directly. Like originally, I didn't think that I was going to do animation, because I'm like, I can't do animation. I can't draw. I'm not good at it. So I was doing modeling, where I just kind of model the characters or model a car or something like that. But when I then went to Vancouver Film School, I had played around with it enough that one of my teachers was like, did you ever think about doing animation, because you see time? And I always said, like, no, I didn't think of that because I can't draw. And my mentor at the time was a cinematographer at Pixar, Jerka Helen, great mentor. And she just said, like, well, some of the best animators at Pixar, they can't draw either. They use the computer. So I started doing some small tests, and yeah, I could see time in a way that people don't necessarily think about time. And that helped me as an animator. So, I mean, if you do art, you can do concept art. And if you show that you're a great artist in a way, and you have a good portfolio, maybe you can start as a concept artist or something like that for games. But go to a school, learn 3D, or if you're more of I can sit down on my computer and I'm good at programming websites or something like that, I'd like to know more about programming, like C++ or something, or C#. Yeah, then maybe find a school where you can take a bachelor's degree in programming. That could definitely be a way in.
I think we have said a lot, and I want to thank you for taking the time, Lars.
Of course.
Very informative. And I've known you for a long time, but I didn't know in depth.
Well, there's much to talk about, and I could continue, but yeah.
Yeah, for sure. Maybe another time I'll interview you again.
But I mean, I would say this: if somebody is curious that listen to this and they reach out to you and have more specific questions on also how to get into the industry or where to study and stuff like that, feel free to pass along their questions, and I should try and do my best to answer them too.
Thank you. That's very kind. I will do so. Yeah, for sure. Engineers and programmers, if you fancy video games, it is the right industry to be looking for jobs. It is a growing multi-billion-dollar industry, and there doesn't seem to be any end to its development. Write me at jobtalespodcast@gmail.com if you want to ask Lars any question about this job.